Um, lecture number 5 for chapter 14. Honestly, originally I had designed the last two, or the last subsection, the last section here, to actually be part of lecture number 4, and it just got a little out of hand. so there's a close connection between this presentation and the last presentation. It's a really extension of the 4th lecture, because we're starting off with this Arrhenius equation that we established from the last presentation. We're not dealing so much with that guy. We're dealing more with this guy in terms of what we see for these reaction mechanisms. And we'll get to, we'll see another slide here in just a second. And but the purpose for this slide, remind you of the equation, to tell you that this is a less quantitative look at the process, at molecular reactions. How are actually this little in the corner here sort of faded out. How are the molecules colliding? What's controlling the outcome of the products here? That kind of more detailed look at not just A plus B going to C, the simple notion of a reaction that we've dealt with up to this point in all the previous chemistry courses, but actually, what about A? What about B? What happens to these things when they bump in together? Do they form some kind of complex where they're joined up, or do they form something completely different before it evolves to C, if you will? How many steps? There could be just one step. There could be 4 or 5 steps involved in the reaction. And so this reaction mechanism spurring from this particular concept is what we're looking at for this reaction. So how does a reaction take place? Energy, it's got to have collision, and then the proper orientation. For all these things have to come together before products are formed. And just very quickly, there's the orientation issue. It can be the same molecules colliding, but if they're oriented incorrectly, there's no reaction here. And then also there's that certain amount of energy that you can think of it as kinetic energy, as motion, if you will, that the molecules have to acquire from the temperature of the solution, from colliding with each other. This inelastic collision where A and B collide together, and B goes away with more energy than it came with, if you will. It pulled the energy from another molecule. So this energy diagram, this is what we're getting at. We're not necessarily going to look at this kind of detail in an energy diagram or reaction mechanism, but getting comfortable with these kind of bumps and valleys that you see for these kinds of descriptions of the chemical reaction. So first off, just what do the two numbers tell us? And I sort of previewed this in the last talk. Let me go through a little bit more detail. And just when I look at these reactions, what do I see? What do I pick out when I'm looking at these energy diagrams? Well, one thing to note, the x-axis isn't labeled, but think of that as time, as a reaction progressing from initial point to some final point. Potential energy, you can think of heat for a chemical reaction. That's fine for us. You can think of kinetic energy. What are all the components of energy that are making up the potential energy, the total energy of the system, or the total energy of the molecules. For a given, this is an overall reaction. This is going from our reactants over to products. So these diagrams are actually fairly simple. Compare the one bump here to something with multiple bumps, and how do you interpret something like this? Okay, it's more complicated, and we'll look at it here in a minute. This is less complicated. We have numerical values here describing what's happening. And a couple questions I ask myself, is it the exothermic versus endothermic is an important question. Next chapter, chapter 19, we start digging into this in a great detail. So endothermic, exothermic, reminder from chapter 5, Gen Chem 1 is important here. Because, somewhere in the 19th century, scientists started, they saw spontaneous reactions. Like, if you have a balloon filled with helium, you set a match to it, it's going to blow up. That's a spontaneous reaction. What's controlling that spontaneous reaction? Why does it do it? Do we have some method that allows us to predict a spontaneous reaction? What components are involved in that? That's what chapter 19 really gets into. And to tell you the truth, that's really one of the very important concepts in chemistry, at least in my book. How can we describe a particular reaction? Whether it's an explosion, whether it's what's happening inside of a gasoline engine, or what's happening inside of an organism when enzymes come along and do manipulations on molecules. It's all, is the thing going to happen? What are the factors that are controlling it? And it comes in, this exothermic and endothermic is tied into that concept, because early on, one hypothesis, if you will, was that, exothermic reactions tend to be spontaneous. The blowing up of a hydrogen balloon is a good example. And so recognizing that these two are exothermic might help us in terms of determining whether it's spontaneous or not. Again, we'll get a fuller picture of that in the next chapter. Here we're just sort of thermic. We're just trying to identify which is which, to tell you the truth. And how do we know whether it's exothermic? Well, the exothermic is telling us, I guess the question you should ask is, what happens just from initial and final states? Meaning, initial and final. How do you compare those two? In both of these cases, there's been a decrease in position along the potential energy y-axis. There's been a release of energy. And you can do heat, minus 10 here, minus 15 here. Remember, this is going to be negative. It's going to be less than 0 for an exothermic reaction. In this particular example, this is an endothermic reaction. We've actually gained energy during that process from products to reactants. Now, just getting in on spontaneous reaction, which I do find interesting, they're, like I said, 19th century exothermic reactions, that's spontaneous reaction. But there's plenty of examples of endothermic reactions that are spontaneous. Like if you put any kind of salt in water and then record the temperature and study that thermodynamically, you find it's an endothermic reaction. The reaction actually absorbs heat from the surroundings. But it's spontaneous. It happens without any kind of intervention. You mix the two things together. Let's say you give it enough energy to get it going, and then if it keeps going on its own, that's a spontaneous reaction. So it's a big deal, whether it's exothermic or endothermic. And we can see here that, this is the most exothermic. It releases the most heat during the reaction. And it's not necessarily a function of, think 1 mole here, 1 mole here, 1 mole here. Okay, that's fine. Now, the amount of heat to release it's a extensive property. It depends on the amount of material you have in front of you. But for these diagrams, you can see that this is the most exothermic. Now, what about the Arrhenius equation? That's the other thing. So 1, exothermic, endothermic. 2, activation energy. What does that tell us? Well, actually, let me do this in red so we can distinguish the two. How tall is your energy barrier? So, remember, this is the energy barrier. Think of the picture last time of the woman golfing and having to strike the ball hard enough to get over the hill before the green. This is the hill. This is the amount of energy that the molecules must acquire before they make it over to the product side. And the activation energy, the largest activation energy, and we can see it here, that 25 kilojoules per mole, it's the largest bump for all three of these. I would say this is the slowest reaction. given similar conditions, given, I don't know, concentrations about the same, temperature about the same, that kind of issue. You know, if everything else is sort of comparable between the three reactions, three different chemical reactions, then, you know, this would probably be the slowest reaction of the bunch. You know, this is the one that would benefit the most, if you will, from increasing the temperature. If you're sitting there waiting for the reaction to occur, jack up the temperature. Then the molecules, well, they acquire enough energy to make it over the barrier here. Now, when you think about exothermic versus or energy considerations versus activation energy for a more complicated graph, you know, what you see here is with this kind of thing. And let me just sort of, well, one thing I want to point out is, well, it is an endothermic reaction. So it does absorb heat from the surroundings as the reaction occurs. It's a rather complicated reaction. You know, these are reactants. These are products. These are the first thing you should be able to pick out. So that's part of it. What about just going back to that previous slide? I said activation energy. Well, each bump has a different activation energy. So there would actually be three different activation energies for each of these elementary steps. Okay, so each bump here represents a separate chemical reaction, really. And we'll look at an example here in a minute or so. This separate chemical reaction, which we're going to label as an elementary step, are the steps that the reactants go through before they make it to the product side. You know, in a typical, overall reaction, what we've seen up to this point, all we would see would be A going to D. Well, in reality, this pathway now we know is made up of much more complicated steps. We got to go from A to B. Then B gets switched over to C, and then C is the makes its final journey toward D to the product side. And so you have these intermediates, which is the proper term here. Something you need to be able to recognize. So each trough between reactants and products are making up something called intermediates. These are the things that you see from the graph over here that are formed during the reaction through each elementary step, but they don't stick around. They're transient. They're short-lived species. Okay. So again, you know, each bump represents an individual 1, 2, 3 elementary steps that's required to form the overall reaction. And then, you know, each one of these steps has a corresponding activation energy given by, and you can quantitate these things. You know, this is by far the largest. So I can say E-act, we'll say 2, is greater than either of the other two, and then this E-act 3 is the smallest. Well, what did I say about the previous example? I said that the larger the activation energy, the slower the reaction, and then let's see, actually, yeah, and then the smallest, the best example is this guy. You know, and let me switch colors again so we can sort of make a distinction from, you know, this would be the slowest step. This is important. I'm just not rattling off just because I like to hear myself talk. That's a big deal. Slowest step, we'll come back to in a minute. And then this would be the fastest step. You know, if I'm thinking about this reaction, this is sort of slow, A to B. B to C is very slow. We actually refer to this as the rate limiting step. So again, slowest step is the rate limiting step. It's the bottleneck. It controls the outcome of the reaction on a kinetic level. And then C to D, I mean, as soon as C is formed, this intermediate, some high energy, unstable molecule that typically would not look like a normal Lewis structure, I'd put it that way. Once it forms, it rapidly converts over to D because the activation energy is so slow. So this one is very rapid, fast. It doesn't control the overall reaction. It's only this step and anything before it actually is controlling the overall reaction. And so one thing to appreciate in this sort of simplified notion, believe it or not, is that these two first steps, anything from the slow reaction and backward, this would be where the rate law comes from. We're actually going to see an example of that here in a minute. Sort of look at some of this and talk about it. But the slow step, let me just think about cars traveling down some road, and this is a stoplight that just stays red for you, and you tend to get a backup at that particular point. In this example, that's a stoplight that stays red all the time, and that's where you get the backup. Well, the heavy traffic here, it's essentially trying to climb over that rate limiting step. There's our two terms. The two terms are interchangeable: rate limiting step or rate determining step. They're both telling you the same thing. It corresponds to that one step along the pathway that's the bottleneck. Right? That one step in traffic that slows everything down, or the one step in the reaction that has that highest energy barrier that the molecule can just barely get over. And again, it's what defines the rate law. Now let's look at an example. See, what am I talking about that? Well, this is a problem I pulled from the book. It's a breakdown of ozone here, and what we have, this is an overall reaction. And it's a fairly complicated reaction. I mean, I don't know actually, it's giving us a rate. Right. Now, if you know the elementary steps, you can figure out the rate constant. That's one possibility. But all this is asking for is the data consistent? Because when an overall reaction is being looked into, there's a variety of methods that are used, and what you do is you start picking apart the molecule and you start picking apart the reaction, and what you find is that when ozone and the nitrogen dioxide come together, what happens is that there's a short period of time where nitrogen trioxide is detected by some method, but it's not actually showing up in the original reactant. So the scientists would know, well, somewhere along the way there's a step that forms the nitrogen trioxide, and then since it doesn't show up in the final products, then there's some step where the nitrogen trioxide is consumed. And so on the long path toward deducing a mechanism, you start proposing these different elementary steps that based on the empirical data you're generating, and then based on what you know about the molecules as well and how the things are going to react, or how they may have reacted in other situations. And so you propose this particular model. These would be referred to, so I said the overall reaction here, well, these are the elementary steps. Each one of these would, each one of these bumps, this guy, corresponded to an elementary step. So in this example, if I'm proposing two elementary steps, then I would see two bumps along on the energy diagram. I'll draw that. I'll speculate that here in a second. Because the problem is actually saying, the experimental rate law. So there's actually, what they're doing is they're running experiments like you saw in the first 3 video lectures for this chapter. Some variation of that kind of data. And they see that experimentally the rate law is this. So this I would treat this as known data or reliable data. And then what you say, these elementary steps, does this fit with the data that we have here? Well, what you need to think about is that this is the slow step. That's part of it. And then also this notion that elementary steps are going to add up to form the overall reaction. Because remember, when B and C are formed during this reaction, they're consumed completely during the reaction, and you just get left over with D. And so, you're going to see the overall reaction from start to finish. Let's say once the thing reaches equilibrium, this is really what you're going to be seeing, detecting in the reaction pot. But it's gone through these three different individual elementary steps. And what we can do is to check this. You can actually add up these formulas, and let me sort of try to do that. If I pretend like I'm adding this up, well, anything that's showing up on the reactant side of one and the product side of the other, you can cancel out when you add up the thing. Now if you add up the two elementary steps, do you have what you know is true, the overall reaction? And we do. We have one ozone molecule. We have two NO2 molecules as the only two reactants and left over from the two elementary steps after we've canceled out the intermediate. Remember, an intermediate is anything that is produced in one and then consumed in another and does not show up in the overall reaction. Add up the product side. We have that guy corresponding to what we know is true. We can measure we can see the two products that are formed during the reaction. And what we see is that these two elementary steps are actually consistent with the overall reaction. So that's good. That's one check that we can say about the two proposed elementary steps for this mechanism. And then, what can we say about the relative rates? Well, this is where remember that rate law is determined by the slow step. Well, what is actually showing up in the slow step? We have ozone to first order and NO2 to a first order. That would be a 1 up there. Well, that is corresponding to the 1 and the 1 in the elementary step. So this is one place where you can take the molar coefficients. If you know this is the rate law and you have one elementary step that corresponds to, if these numbers corresponds to the molar coefficients, 1 and 1, then it's suggesting that this is the slow step. Remember, there's a direct connection between slow step and the rate law. In this case, the rate law is given to us. And then this would indicate that it's the fast step. And that's typically true. I mean, the intermediates are usually the ones that react pretty quickly. So, consumptions of intermediates typically occur quickly for the most part. I mean, I'm sure there's some intermediates that are very, actually, yeah, there are. There's intermediates that are fairly stable that can last a while. But the ones you'll see is usually intermediates are consumed rather rapidly. And this isn't part of the question, but I want to sort of extrapolate what might the energy diagram look like. Well, I'm going to assume that it's exothermic. That means that I know how, I'm going to start off high and I'm going to go low. Okay, so, but actually this data doesn't tell me whether it's exothermic or endothermic. I would need a little bit more data to actually know this is true. I mean, a lot of chemical reactions are exothermic, so it's probably a safe bet that it is. Well, I have two elementary steps. I'm going to have two bumps. The question is, which one's taller than the other? And I know this is the slow step. Slow step starting off from the first one goes to an intermediate. Down in this little trough that I'm forming is where, the NO2 and the O2 are showing up. And then NO2 comes along as also in the reaction mix, slams with the intermediate, and then there's a small bump before it drops down to the product side, and then the reactant side. So again, 1, 2 bump corresponds to 1, 2 elementary steps, and then the largest energy barrier is the slow step, and that we know it's a slow step because it corresponds to that rate law there. And then, I mean, the magnitude of the energy barrier here is going to vary. I'm just guessing that it's fairly shallow. One thing I do know for sure is that it's not going to be larger than that guy. Okay, it's not going to, energy barrier is not going to increase here. It's going to be something smaller than that fella. And then since I'm assuming it's exothermic, I know that once it reaches over that bump, it'll drop in energy lower than where the reactant started. Okay, so endothermic, exothermic, you got to compare R versus P where they are, and then the elementary steps is this middle portion here. Okay. There's some terms that get thrown around here. You know, if you look at this reaction, 1, 2, 3 things, 3 reactants are together. Now, there's a chance that all 3 molecules could collide. Let me back up for a minute. Remember, molecules must collide and they must have the proper orientation. A, B, and B. You know, for these things to meet just right. And for them just to collide is a lower chance. And then for them to have the exact orientation of all 3 molecules, that's even a lower chance. So you know, just looking at this reaction, I'm not a kineticist, I'll put it that way, but looking at this reaction, I mean, the stoichiometry of the overall reaction suggesting 3 things coming together, I mean, I know that's unlikely. So I sort of, if I was doing this problem, I'd anticipate, well, there's at least another elementary step somewhere along the way. And that's typically what you see. You know, those reactions where 3 things are colliding together are referred to as a termolecular reaction. And they're just rare. Honestly, I'm not sure if you're going to see any of these. Bimolecular, unimolecular are much more common. Now what they're doing here is they're showing the rate law for that particular elementary step. Remember what I told you in the last slide. I didn't talk about it a lot, but if you have an elementary step, and please, there's a big difference between elementary step versus overall reaction. Overall reaction, you know, see videos 1 through 3 here. Actually, you could include 4 as well. See 1 through 4 for overall reaction, especially in how it relates to the rate, you know, K, whatever, the rate law. Now, this is different. If you're talking about an elementary step in the overall reaction, and you can see there, you can have multiple elementary steps. You know, if you're trying to gain the rate law just for an elementary step, then you can just use the molar coefficients here. Now, for example, there's 2 A's here, and you see that it's bimolecular. It's second order with respect to A. So for the elementary steps, you can just take it as is for the reaction in front of you. And then, you know, what we saw on that last example. Well, again, how did we know that this first elementary step was the rate limiting step? Well, because the molecularity of the first elementary step correspond to the rate law that was determined experimentally. So I guess that's another aspect here. You know, again, if the elementary step, if these molar coefficients on the elementary step correspond to the overall reaction, the experimentally determined rate law, then that's telling you which one is the slow step. And then once you have that, you know, if you have just the elementary step, it's only that particular situation where the molar coefficients correspond to what number each of those are raised to, which is an important point. That's not always the case there. If you look back at these videos, especially number 2, and in the homework and the quizzes, there are examples where you may have a reactant present, but it's not showing up in the overall rate. Actually, that's how it was here. There was a 2, right? You can't do this. This is not true. You can't take the molar coefficients of overall reaction because it doesn't tell you anything about the rate limiting step. It just tells you point A to point B, reactants to products. Those two big, ends of the reaction. Anything in the middle is a mystery. You can't do this. You can't take the molar coefficients and just start raising it to the power. You'll get it wrong. You can only do that if you're talking about individual elementary steps. Because then you're looking at the guts of the reaction, looking at really detailed parts of the reaction where, that first hump that it has to go over is only dealing with those two specific ones, and any kind of extraneous molecules floating around that's not part of the slow step, they're not going to show up in your overall reaction, or the constant rate law for your overall reaction. Looking at this reaction here, I'm thinking that, well, I guess this is possible, one reaction or one reactant, two reactants coming together to bimolecular reaction. So that's possible here. And they have proposed a mechanism here. And let's just look at the problem. Well, first off, is the proposed mechanism consistent with the overall reaction? And then these are elementary steps. And what you do is you want to add up the two elementary steps, or however many you have, and see what you have. So any intermediates are removed, and I think those are, there's no other intermediate. And then once you add these two up, you see MoCO3 there, CO6, sorry, and then the phosphorus compound there. There's our more complicated organometallic, and then there is our carbon monoxide. And so it does add up to the overall reaction. So A is yes. B, what is the molecular each step of the mechanism? Okay, so each step of the mechanism referring to these elementary steps. Well, the first one is a unimolecular, just one thing dissociating is what's happening. One of the carbon dioxide molecules are falling off the metal. And then two things are colliding together. It's a bimolecular reaction. And then finally identify the intermediates, which we've already done. Like I said, whatever cancels out during the reaction is our intermediate. And there could be many intermediates during a reaction, so keep that in mind. Now, another example that I want to go through is this is a hydrolysis reaction that I just can't put down. I think I've used this maybe each lecture, possibly. I'm not sure. It's an organic reaction, and it's actually presenting well, I guess actually the same way. We have the overall reaction in step 1 and step 2, so these are our elementary steps. What intermediates are present? Well, like I said, you may not, I said it in passing earlier, but usually an intermediate looks like some weird Lewis structure, something that you don't typically see in Gen Chem 1 especially. You may have dealt a few times with carbon with a plus charge in drawing Lewis structure, but it wasn't something that was emphasized anyway. And so, that's one thing to look for, but ultimately it's, from step 1 to step 2 or step 3, however many's there, whatever compound that is formed in one, consumed in the other, and it's not present in the overall reaction would be the intermediate here. Okay? And then also, I'm going to go ahead and tell you that this is the slow step in the reaction. The rate constant that was given to you, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 times now, and I'm going to use just the label R for this guy. This is experimentally determined rate constant from the raw data that was generated from a particular lab. And it's only dependent upon this alkyl halide is what they're called. And notice that the only of the two elementary steps here, only this one corresponds in terms of molecularity. Remember, if you're talking about a elementary step, you can just take whatever's showing up on the reactant side for the elementary step and use the molar coefficients, right? 1, 2, 3 of A's here, and then you see it's a third order reaction with respect to A. That only happens with elementary steps. Well, notice what happens here. This particular elementary step is the only, if you write out the rate for this thing, it matches with the overall rate reaction that we determined earlier. And so this is how I've determined that that is the slow step. I also know this is an exothermic reaction, and so I can draw the energy diagram for this one too. Big first step, there's our little trough forming. Second step, very fast, and then the exothermic. And so this is where that carbon with a positive charge is showing up in this little trough. This is where the intermediate is here. And then again, each one of these corresponds to an elementary step, 1 and 2. Reactant, product, exothermic, there's been a decrease in the energy levels for those two positions. So that's about all that we're going to see with the energy diagram reaction mechanism. I know it's a lot, but it's really just sort of the basic pieces putting things together. If you take the organic, you'll see you'll use this quite a bit actually in terms of understanding different aspects of a chemical reaction. You actually study this is referred to as an SM1 mechanism. Substitution, nucleophilic, unimolecular are the labels there. Unimolecular, one molecule involved in the rate limiting step. Substitution, the OH from water, coming from water, is being substituted here, or is substituting itself for the chlorine. And then the overall reaction, there's something called a nucleophile thrown in there, so the nucleophilic for the N. Anyway, you won't be tested on that, but I teach organics, so I can't help it. I gotta expand on that. Last thing, we have these catalysts here. These two are important. It lowers activation energy, and it changes the reaction pathway. So this is a good little example. Hydrogen peroxide with bromine and acidic solution, when it uncatalyzed reaction and the energy barrier is pretty high, it just goes through one bump. In this particular example, I'm not sure what the catalyst is. Maybe an enzyme, who knows. It's pulled from the book. The book will tell you if you're curious. Notice that the pathway changes. You have an additional intermediate showing up, whatever that may be, and there's actually 2 elementary steps that are involved in the reaction. The first elementary step is this mixture going to that mixture. Oh, I can actually identify. The intermediate is, no, it's not H2O. Oh, Br2. Usually intermediates are reactive. Br2 is pretty reactive. It's that guy here. Notice that it forms in the trough here, the intermediates, what's at the end of this elementary step, but it doesn't show up either on the product side or the reactant side. That's how I identified it was the intermediate. And another thing about a catalyst does change. So, like from the initial to final state, or I should say, let me say initial and final state. Catalyst is the same. Somewhere in between, it does change somehow, whether it's a different conformational state or, well, let's just look at a couple examples. One, this is called a hydrogenation reaction, and let me just sort of quickly write out the Lewis structures about what's going on here. We got something called ethylene. This is another example from organic chemistry. Hydrogen gas comes along. Reaction. what you do is you break that pi bond, the double bond. Remember, when you have multiple bonds, one will be called a sigma bond, electron densities between the two nuclei, and the other one is called a pi bond, electron density above and below the two nuclei, or above and below the sigma bond, really. Jenkin 1, just a reminder. So you break the pi bond during the reaction. When you mix these two things together, I mean, at room temperature, I can't imagine the reaction proceeding very rapidly. If you heat it up, it'd probably help a little bit, of course. You throw in some platinum, palladium, nickel, some metal from the middle part of the periodic table. I mean, some don't, of course. Those three work best. There's a few others that you see here and there. And what you get is a breaking it down of the pi bond much more effectively. And what happens, this surface here would be the metal that they're trying to describe. And you just have rows of, let's say, platinum atoms sitting there. And there's some kind of chemical modification. Both, this is where, this was hydrogen, actually, originally. It gets broken apart on the surface, and then the ethylene, this guy here, absorbs to the surface as well. So what's happening? There's chemical modification occurring between the catalyst and the reactants. Both are chemically modified. There is a slight change occurring with each of those platinum atoms that are being interacted with here. What it does is it lowers the activation energy. It allows for this reaction to proceed more easily. In the final state, the platinum surface is the same. It's been modified during the reaction, but then it comes back to a pristine state, if you will. It's the same old platinum atom once everything's said and done. That's like the organic chemistry side of a catalyst, catalytic hydrogenation. The other one, enzymatic reactions, are catalyzed. So the enzyme here, these are, well, large or small. Typically they're bigger than what we're used to. I'll put it that way. They're rather large polymers that you find in an organism, proteins, and what they do is they catalyze particular reactions. And so those molecules that they react upon, given the label a substrate, you form a complex between the enzyme substrate complex, it's called, and then here you have the products being kicked off. Now, one thing, this schematic diagram is well, it's pretty simple. It gets the point across. These two have to bind up, and then there's some chemical reaction occurring, and then the initial and the final state, the enzyme, is the same. Now, what's happening here? The enzyme is being modified just a little bit. There can be chemical associations between the enzyme and the substrate here, and then there's typically some kind of conformational state or conformational change that occurs. Remember what I said, catalysts get changed somehow, but once they initially and finally, in those initial and final states, they look the same. There's probably, at some point the catalyst might get damaged if it's repeated use over and over again. But in the simple definition of catalyst, it's the same thing as it was before. So then you have this, what's referred to as an active site, that's open for more substrates to come along and react with it. Okay. So in the end, just remember these three main features for a catalyst and a chemical reaction. I guess the last thing, notice it doesn't affect actually. It's still an exothermic reaction with the same amount of energy that's kicked off. It only affects the elementary steps of the reaction. Okay? And now we have come to the end of chapter 14. Thanks.